welcome again to another episode of Voices of Veterans. We've been a little absent for the past couple of weeks because there's been some work being done here at HPA Television. They've been redoing the studios. They look very nice, and we're so happy to be able to use the resources that Hartford Public Access Television has put at our disposal here so that we can communicate the voices of veterans and also have programming that's done by Hartford residents in the interest of Hartford residents. And so in relation to that, I'd like to start off this session with a PSA, a public service announcement. There are elections coming up, as you all know, in Connecticut and in Hartford. In fact, as a matter of interest, we have primary elections being held for offices in the Hartford legislature, the Connecticut legislature, and we have a number of independent people running who petitioned their way onto the ballot. And I'd just like to mention a candidate who's running in the Minnie Gonzalez district, running for the state of Connecticut legislature. Her name is Gannon Long. She's running for the state legislature. She's a young woman who's went to Hartford Public High School and graduated with one of my daughters from Hartford Public High School. She's also been active and worked in Washington, D.C. during the Obama administration. She's also active in the LGBT group of people that are advocating for rights for those who are lesbians and also gay activists. And in relation to that, I just want to mention that she's running in the state of Connecticut. The primary will be August 14th. So please remember to vote for Gannon Long. And she's one of those people who represents people like a veteran like Leonard Matlovich, who was 3 tours in Vietnam. He was awarded the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and he died of HIV/AIDS. And he had a tombstone erected in Arlington Cemetery as one of the nation's heroes. And on his tombstone it says, "They gave me medals for killing 2 men and destroyed my life for loving one." And I just want to bring that up as an indication that to serve in the United States military, it doesn't matter what your gender is, or what your sexual activity is, or what your beliefs are. If you swear an oath to protect and defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, you should be recognized for that, and you should be honored for that because you fulfilled your duty, and voluntarily so. And Leonard Matlovich was one of those men who came out and revealed himself, despite the fact that he knew he received a general discharge from the Air Force after 12 years of service. He also grew up as an Air Force brat, similar to myself. So that was my public service announcement in regard to Gannon Long running for the state legislature. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the damage done, and I have an interesting book here called Chasing Ghosts, A Soldier's Fight for America from Baghdad to Washington, written by Paul Rieckhoff. I'm going to read a little bit from his book here, from chapter 18. It's called Fighting the Media War. Times have not become more violent. They have just become more televised. He starts off the chapter with that quote, and the quote comes from Marilyn Manson, who many of you millennials will probably know. Paul writes, "We struggled constantly to deal with the meddlesome and judgmental press. They infested Baghdad like roaches. We almost universally despised them. As far as I was concerned, any journalist who agreed to be embedded with the military surrendered all claims to professional impartiality. There's a good reason people call them embedded journalists. How could they possibly report freely and accurately when we guarded their asses? They were mobbed up, so to speak. As the violence escalated and independent reporting became more dangerous, reporters were entirely dependent upon the Pentagon for access to the war and to the story. They saw only what the military brass let them see. Their every step was guided by military chaperones. They depended on the military to protect their skins if the situation ever got dicey, and we grunts were not allowed to speak freely to them. Our commanders censored and monitored us constantly. Speaking and out complaining, telling the truth could get a soldier into a whole world of trouble with his superiors. It was no wonder so much of the coverage I saw of the war on the internet or in the articles my friends mailed me from home was so weak and inaccurate. They never got the other side, the Iraqi side. Where was the last time you saw Colonel Ollie North interviewing an Iraqi about Operation Kick-Ass, or whatever clever name the Army came up with? It would be the equivalent of a reporter covering the story of a white cop shooting a black man in an American inner city and then only interviewing the cops, not the family and the neighbors, to get their take on the event. You'd only get 50% of the story, and a very slanted 50% at that. Most of the press sat in a protected palace enclave, sharing the same sources and calling themselves investigative journalists. If reporters wanted to get the real story, they would have to go out and walk the streets of Iraq without military protection. They might get their heads cut off, but it'd be a hell of a story. War reporting should not be about balance. It should be about accuracy. There's never a perfect equilibrium of good and bad news stories in any situation. People always complain that the news doesn't show enough good stories coming out of Iraq. That's because it's a war zone. The news is already bad. Imagine how much worse the reports would be without all the Pentagon spin. If you want good news stories, go to Disneyland. For grunts, having a reporter or a TV crew around was mainly just a pain in the ass. Most of them were what we called jock sniffers. Many just wanted to do their time in the war zone so they could earn their combat reporting stripes and get the hell home. Some guys tolerated the press better than others. I'll never forget the day one of my squad leaders radioed from the gas station to say there were people there who demanded to speak to me. Who, Willie? A bit sheepishly, he replied that a couple of French reporters had been making nuisances of themselves and refusing to heed his orders, so he'd handcuff them to a lamppost. Doggone Frenchies wouldn't listen to me, LT, he barked. I done told them, but they didn't listen to me, so I tied them up like doggone hogs to a pole. Now they're going to listen. Then there was a radio reporter we were ordered to show around. He was an impossibly chipper British dude, and he showed up at our CP wearing the cleanest, shiniest, dark blue body armor we'd ever seen. Real Darth Vader shit, including a shiny helmet with a big, bright network logo printed on the front. Rydberg saddled up to him. Nice outfit, he said laconically. Haji snipers love these helmets. They get extra points for putting a bullet right through that logo. Really? The reporter grinned nervously. I told Chesty to take the guy out on patrol with him. Chesty hated dealing with reporters even more than most. Sir, do I have to fucking take him? He growled. Sorry, Chesty. Chesty scratched his jaw. Well, can we fuck with his head a little? Knock yourself out. Show him a good time, I shrugged. Chesty and his squad squeezed themselves into a Humvee. In the back, two guys sat on benches on either side. One guy stood in the middle, manning the gun, and they made the reporter sit on the floor in the middle, where he couldn't see anything but the gunner's ass and crotch. As they drove around the dark streets, he tried to do some reporting anyway. He broke out his tape recorder and mic. I'm sitting in the back of an American troop vehicle patrolling the streets of... Shh! Chesty hissed. We're coming into a bad area here. All the guys suddenly looked very serious. They doused the headlights and spoke in tense whispers. The reporter grinned and nodded excitedly, his shiny helmet bobbing. I'm sitting in the back of an American troop vehicle, he whispered into his mic. Suddenly Chesty yelled, Omaha, Omaha, get down, incoming. The vehicle screamed into a hard turn. Overhead, the gunner started banging away deafeningly. The guys shoved the reporter's face to the floor. The Hummer veered and banked left and right as the gunner kept firing, and everyone screamed. Up front, Chesty wore a satisfied grin. They were totally faking it. They were careening around a deserted area of the city, the gunner roaring away at nothing. The reporter wobbled out of the Humvee when they brought him back to the post. His helmet was crooked. A terrified grin was plastered in his shiny face. You all right? I asked him. Splendid, he said. Terribly exciting. Below his shiny black chest armor, I could see that he had pissed himself. I never did hear that report. In September, CBS 60 Minutes came to cover the story of Sergeant Sean Blackwell. Blackwell was the leader of the mortar squad and a good old boy as country as fried chicken and grits. He and his squad were assigned to security duty in front of the Baghdad Ministry of Health building. They swept incoming cars for bombs, checked IDs. He had struck up a friendship with a beautiful Iraqi doctor named Edaha, who regularly passed through the checkpoint. They chatted a little longer every day, and pretty soon they became friends. The CO didn't mind. He had a thing for pretty women, and despite the reservations of the first sergeant, he let it happen. So the woman and a pretty friend would stop by the compound to sit with Blackwell and a grizzled, quiet soldier from 2nd Platoon named Corporal Dagan in the common areas. As long as they were checked for weapons, they weren't left alone. It was allowed. In a few weeks, Blackwell claimed he was in love. Dagan did too. Andy and I were now dealing with 2 of our soldiers double dating in a war zone. There was no law in the UCMJ addressing fraternization with local women. That's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Edah was a smart and gorgeous with big eyes and a pretty smile. She had captivated Blackwell and our commander. While no one was waiting for him back in the States, Blackwell was open-minded or naive enough to give it a shot. It was easy for her to overcome his redneck trailer park background for a ticket out of Baghdad, where all a smart and pretty female doctor could look forward to was the threat of death or kidnapping. Blackwell was a good, solid man, but Edah was way out of his league, and he said so. The whole romance was entirely improbable. I cautioned him at length and kept him on a tight leash, but the CO was all right with it, so I was too. We were all skeptical, but love can emerge in the strangest of circumstances. So they went on with this relationship, and as time would tell, it eventually got to the point where Sergeant Blackwell wanted to marry this girl. So eventually what happened was he got discharged from the military. He went into Jordan and waited for the woman to meet him there, and he took her back to the United States. And so now they live in Baghdad, Florida. The happy couple stayed in Jordan for a while and then flew to the States to begin their new life. They got a book deal. Blackwell worked in a factory. Edah could not qualify for an American medical license and got a job selling shoes in Sears. Welcome to America. I guess you could say that was one story that ended well for one individual. Similar things happened in Vietnam. We had a man in my unit who fell in love with a Vietnamese woman and refused when his DERO date came up when he was supposed to leave country and go back to the United States. He refused to leave without bringing her with him. And eventually he went AWOL, went out into the villages, and as far as we know, they got married in a Buddhist ceremony. They say that love can overcome a lot of things, and maybe it can even overcome war. But that's one story from the war in Iraq. This book is written by Paul Rykoff, who currently heads the Iraq Veterans Association and is working in Washington, D.C. to try to help out with veterans and their healing from the war. Another interesting book that I remembered to pick up is called How Audie Murphy Died in Vietnam. For those of you who know American history, you know Audie Murphy was one of the most decorated soldiers that come out of the Second World War, and then he went into Hollywood and became a movie star. However, as time went by, he suffered from PTSD himself, and it ended up becoming an alcoholic and not even starring in many movies anymore. So this book is written by McAvoy Lane, who's a former Marine. It's called How Audie Murphy Died in Vietnam, and it's written in a kind of a strange kind of way. It's written in like prose. And here, let me just read a couple of small pieces from it. Back on land, more liberty, and bad Sam. For a soul was stretched to touch a stringy suet, and when his heart should have been was that last night's bean dip, smothered with Tabasco. Sam was a bad motherfucker. On Sam. Sure, he was a killer. He could have 5 frags in the air before the first one hit, but it was the ladies who called him Bad Sam. In Search of Courage. More Sam. So it's written like this, in small of prose, and it's very interesting because the story goes on that Audie Murphy gets wounded in Vietnam and then he gets captured. And after he's captured, he gets taken to Hanoi, where he's then released back to the United States, where he goes to meet the president. And as he meets the president, he relates a couple of stories. And here's one on hats and things. Gunny Harlabakis was a lifer. A gunny is a gunnery sergeant in the Marine Corps. He'd hold a weapons inspection in the eye of a hurricane. But no one had told Gunny Harlabakis that this was one place in the Marine Corps where you don't play fuck with the troopies. $120 and a hat got him killed. That's called passing the hat. And those kind of things happened in Vietnam, along with the fraggings. A hat like this, a boonie cap like this, was passed around the company and money was put into it. Whoever picked up the hat then took the job. So Audie Murphy returns to the United States wounded and goes to meet the president. And here's what he has to say. Mr. President, we realize here that you are pursuing an honorable and lasting peace. But sir, the war seems to be the only thing that is lasting. That is why my parents cannot accept the Silver Star. The medals should be given to the peacemakers and the planners for a better world. They should have the Silver Stars. And I would like to ask that all the campaign ribbons being worn today be sent to Washington to rest, and that America become the first civilized country of the world to stop the awarding and wearing of commendation medals for killing. Now, wouldn't that be interesting if they started giving medals to people for saving people and for nurturing life? And so if you think this is the end, you're on the wrong page. And that's the last part of the book. Very interesting reading and eye-opening reading. So I already talked about Leonard Matlovich, but I also want to read this short poem written by Randall Jarrell, who was a former Air Force bombardier in the Second World War. And it's called The Death of a Ball Turret Gunner. Very short poem, but it's right to the point. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. A ball turret gunner was a gunner on the underside of a B-26 bomber or B-24 bomber. He was upside down inside of a glass turret with a 50 caliber machine gun, supposed to be protecting the bottom of the ship from fighter jets. He was very exposed, and Randall Jarrell saw numbers of his people killed, and that's why he wrote this poem, The Ball Turret Gunner. These I often brought into the classroom to show to students in the schools that I talked to when I went in to talk about Vietnam and what it costs. These are 50 caliber slugs. You can hear that when they hit the string. The 50 caliber slug is what would sometimes be fired at the enemy, and the entrance wound and the exit wound are dramatically different. And I just wanted, when I passed these around, the kids would weigh them in their hands and hold them up, and they would realize exactly what this kind of ordnance could do to a human body. These are Zippo lighters. These are what we brought back from Vietnam. These are also what we carried in Vietnam when we set things on fire. There used to be a squad called the Zippo Squad that would go through the villages at the end and set fire to all of the hooches and the thatched roofs of all the homes of the people who lived there. So we did more to create the enemy than we did to subdue the enemy. Because how many friends do you think you made when you burned their homes down? I started reading this article last time. It's called, What If PTSD is More Physical Than Psychological? This is towards the end of the article. It was published in New York Times Magazine. Brandon Matthews is built like a tank with huge humps of muscle outlining his back and shoulders. Ugly scars run down his biceps and forearms, cutting deep creases into the muscle. Others line his legs and sides, allegedly of an 11-year career as an Army Ranger. Matthews, registered with the military as Brandon Matthews Sip, was exposed to so many blasts in Iraq and other places that he cannot count them all. The worst was a suicide bombing that sent him flying down a corridor and left him in a coma. He was hospitalized for months, and his military career was over. But his struggles with brain injury were only starting. I have moments when I forget everything, who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, he told me. It happens almost every day. Sometimes while he's driving. Decisions once easy have become impossible. He turns the kitchen burner on, then walks out, returning to discover a fire raging. Matthews has 24 names tattooed down the center of his back. 18 are former war buddies who were killed in action. The more painful losses, in a sense, are 5 others, friends who have killed themselves since returning from the war. One of them, another special operations veteran with an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury, threatened his wife and children with a gun 6 months ago, Matthews told me, and then shot himself in the head. Matthews spoke at the funeral. Undiagnosed blast injuries are common among special operations soldiers, he said, because members of his military elite prize their toughness and do not want to risk losing their careers. Here's the harsh reality, another veteran told me. In the special forces especially, if I fail my physical, I'm done. That's all there is to it. My cool guy stuff is done. So they keep their heads down, say nothing, and suffer more blasts until one day, like Brandon Matthews, they are too damaged to fight. I met Matthews at a hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he now lives, and within an hour he had consumed several vodka and waters. He was warm and talkative, but every now and then he got a lost, plaintive look in his green eyes. I had the impression of a man who is clinging to a precipice. Before I could turn in, he insisted on steering me to a series of nightclubs where he drank round after round and regaled strangers with his war stories. I asked him about friends, and he told me that almost all of them were dead. He lives on his military pension, and at 33 seems to have given up holding down a job. All this is fairly typical of service members and veterans who have suffered serious or repeated blast injuries. I was told by Susan Ullman, who runs an outreach network called Warrior to Warrior. Ullman's own husband, a Green Beret who suffered a traumatic brain injury, killed himself in 2013. When I asked Matthews about other veterans and suicide, he grimaced and unleashed a string of obscenities about the cowardice of taking your own life. It felt cruel and a little unnecessary to ask if he had been tempted that way himself. He has his own name tattooed on his back after those of his friends who have killed themselves. Even if the underlying wounds of men like Matthews cannot be treated, the symptoms of brain injury, like those of trauma, can often be alleviated. The distinction between organic and emotional injury can be very blurry. Trauma changes neuronal patterns, and therapy can alter a brain that has been physically damaged. Everything we know suggests that people with a structural lesion will also respond to pharmacological and psychological treatment, said David Brody, a neurologist who has worked extensively with the military. Finding the right treatment is the key. Many veterans told me that they had gone to the VA and had been handed pills indiscriminately. A number of mostly untested treatments have gained traction in the past few years, from hyperbaric chambers to ergonomic mouth guards, and some veterans swear by them. In my group alone at the Rocky Hill, almost all of us are on some kind of medication to help us sleep, to help us be calm, and to help us to live with the injury that is the invisible injury that is caused by PTSD, that is called PTSD. Matthews told me he would find some solace in simply being able to see what was going on inside his head. Daniel Pearl is continuing to examine the brains of blast-injured soldiers. After 5 years of working with the military, he feels sure, he told me, that many blast injuries have not been identified. We could be talking many thousands, he said. And what scares me is that what